This is the Just Ride Snowboard channel. I'm Lars Horstmann, and hopefully with a good guideline to find the best stance width for your body and riding style. This topic is so full of different opinions that it's really difficult to find a good starting point. So I'm going to be all up front with you. There's no such thing as one formula that will spit out your perfect stance width for all conditions and everything you want to do on any given snowboard you want to ride. It is a little bit more difficult than that, and we'll get there in a minute. Many decisions we make in snowboarding in regards to the gear we choose and the way we set it up are based on trying to find a good balance between stability and mobility. When you think of your boots, for example, most people prefer a boot that is firm enough to give them a good amount of support while also giving enough flex to stay mobile around the ankle joint. So there's always this dance to find a good balance between those two. We need stability for good balance, and guess what? We need mobility for the exact same reason, because snowboarding, after all, is balance through movement. The two key movements that do somewhat depend on your stance width are up and down through your ankle and knee joints, and fore aft, as in from foot to foot. There's a lot of other movements that contribute to good balance, but they have less to do or depend less on your stance width. So the wider you go with your stance, the longer it will take to move your weight from foot to foot, simply because the distance between the 2 feet has increased. So if you go too wide, your setup basically becomes what I would call overstable. And that is the opposite of mobile. Sometimes that greater stability feels really good. Like, for example, when you're going super fast, like straight lining down a hill or doing board slides on a rail, that great platform underneath you just suggests great stability. Now, as soon as the terrain, for example, becomes more technical and you need to be agile and you need to move quickly from foot to foot to make it around obstacles or through bumps or whatever, you will then realize that the time it takes for you to move your weight from foot to foot is just too long and creates a certain amount of immobility, and that will cause you to lose balance. In regards to the vertical movement in a wider stance, that can be quite nice for some people, simply because it requires less flexibility to squat when your feet are further apart. Now, when we're looking at a narrow stance setup, it's obviously somewhat the opposite. So what we find is we can shift our weight real quickly because the distance between our feet is much smaller. So fore-aft movement is really quick and effective. However, we also move our center of mass further up while reducing the width of our platform that we're standing on. And that is a setup that I would call understable. So very tall, skinny objects with a small platform, like a big drink bottle or whatever, can obviously be tipped over really easily. So in that kind of setup, it's much harder to maintain good balance on a snowboard, and also it somewhat reduces your ability to bring pressure into the tips of the board. And that is actually quite an important thing to be able to do in a lot of situations when you're snowboarding. In regards to vertical movement, you could say that in a narrower stance you have a larger range of motion, because with the legs closer together you can extend taller. So having that larger range of movement can in certain situations contribute to better balance. However, what I said earlier, it is easier to squat in a wider stance, so that would allow for you to actually get lower. So it's all a bit relative here, right? It depends a bit on your flexibility, and that just adds another variable to the stance game. So as you see, we've got overstable, we've got understable, and every good thing apparently has its flip side. And on top of that, it is all completely depending on your body shape, on your flexibility, whether you're bow-legged or cross-legged. It all has some form of an influence on your stance width and even on your stance angles. So where in the world do we start with a good reference? So there's all kinds of theories out there around reference marks for stance width. And my favorite one is just go shoulder width apart. I personally don't understand what my shoulders have to do with my legs, and that's what attaches to my bindings. So if you consider body shapes and proportions, for example, there's quite a few guys out there that have quite a broad chest with big shoulders, long torso, short legs. Now, if I apply the shoulder measurement to their stance width, I'll end up in a stance that is much too wide for their legs. And as we just explored, that'll just create immobility, and it can't be very good riding when you're set up that way. The best guideline that I've ever come across on this subject actually comes from a Nidecker Snowboards catalog that I flipped through a few years ago, and I've applied their method to God knows how many hundreds of customer setups in the retail shop that I worked in. And I want to say that's potentially the truest guideline out there, and that is all it is, a guideline. I do think that they didn't consider one very important thing that I'm going to throw into the mix here. So let's have a look at what that all is. So Nidecker went and did some research with medical professionals and supposedly came to the conclusion that based on Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, the measurement taken from the center of your kneecap all the way down to the ground without shoes is what they call your natural stance. In that stance width, you're supposedly stable and well balanced while also still being quite mobile. And what they then did is basically took the natural stance, and depending on your discipline, depending on your riding style, they're adding certain amounts. So for example, if you're just purely carving in a double positive stance, they suggest to just go with your natural stance width, kneecap to the ground. That's pretty narrow, but for carving that's good, because you need to compress the center of the board, you need to bend the board. So with a narrower stance, a board flexes most naturally, and board flex is key in carving. So that's actually pretty good advice. Then they go beginners and all mountain riders add 2 centimeters to the natural stance. If you're more into free riding, where you go in higher speeds with bigger drops, you need a little bit more stability. They are saying at 4 centimeters. And then finally, if you're totally like rails guy, just hanging out in the park, jibbing all day, you might want even more stability, and they suggest adding 6 to 10 centimeters. So when I read 6 to 10, I was like, whoo, that's a big jump. The beauty of this scheme is that it's relative, that they're not trying to tell you this is right, this is wrong, don't do this, do that instead. They're giving you a range. And the beauty of that is that it naturally somewhat considers that we are all different, but it gives you a frame. So it basically saves you the time that you'd be tapping in the dark in those red zones of human biomechanics, totally, out of order stance widths that simply don't work. So it saves you some time, and I think that's a pretty good method to start with. Now, the one thing they didn't consider in that formula is the width of your pelvis. And as much as that has nothing to do with your leg length, it does determine how far your legs are apart in the first place. So just if you consider getting on this formula there and measuring your natural stance and then going from there, please also consider whether you have a wider or a narrower pelvis. And that's also a bit relative. I don't know any scientific measurements on what defines a narrow pelvis, but I'm just taking, for example, my waist size in pants. Like I'm usually a 29 or 30, and I know that I'm a fairly skinny frame. So I'm like using that Nidecker recommendation, but I'm sticking to the narrower side of that range. So for example, my natural stance would be 52 centimeters. And when I'm out on my Stranda pipeliner, that's like that 185 soft boot carver where I rock a fairly aggressive positive stance, I actually mounted at 51 centimeters. That's a centimeter less than my narrower, my natural stance. But then on my big mountain freeride board, you know, like stepping into somewhat gnarlier terrain, or like knowing that I'm literally just riding off piste all day, I want more stability, I want more platform, I'm going up to 55. That's 4 centimeters more. On most of my boards I'm 53 or 54 centimeters depending on what the insert pattern offers. But what that should show you is simply that there is no such thing as your stance width. Ideally, if you have a bit of a quiver, and obviously that's a first world problem, but if you have a bit of a quiver, you should ask yourself, well, what makes sense? Like, I don't have to keep stance width X on snowboard Y. Like you know, it doesn't really make sense sometimes. And the best thing to do is take a tape measure, take a screwdriver, don't be shy, and be curious, you know, like just experiment with it. And I think this particular guideline offers a starting point that may save you quite some detours. All right, I hope that'll help you to find a reasonable starting point for your stance width. Let me know in the comments what you're actually riding and why that works for you so well. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like what you're seeing, and share the love and get the notifications so you don't miss out on what's coming up next. Have fun experimenting. Take care.